And I'm getting so much more material down. So when I do like individual feedback, I can go through every single they said that and I'm like, and we had like an I did one time and I was like, I did really well. There's sometimes my guys would have made me Flora. Such a would openly playing League of Legends during the like when you there was a one I realized they could see that there was just like on Facebook during my partner's speech. And are they the only judge? They weren't. Oh, really? They still swung around. Like trying to what's going on to do? Four of us. Sorry, bud. Can some of you real fast the trophies? We want to give them trophies. We won't. I will probably be here. Yeah. Actually, every single one. Right in front of the trophy. Check my phone. Order. And I'll call this house to order. Now, first off, I would like to congratulate both teams for making it into the grand final of the International Tournament. On proposition side today, we have USA Blue. On opposition side, we have USA D Team Red. The motion before this House is that this House believes that Democratic candidates should prioritize ideological purity over party unity in the November 2018 congressional election. My name is Bo. I'll be the chair for this round of debate. With me on the panel, on my left, we have Beverly, and then behind me from left, we have Estefania, we have Rifat, and we have Ajay. I love this. Sorry about that. So without further ado, may I now call upon the first speaker from the proposition team to open this very exciting round of debate, please. Here.
Since the advent of our democracy, the American political system has prided itself on a reverence for individual idea, diversity of thought, and diversity of opinion. But as each party retreats farther and farther into their respective doctrines, we have lost what makes our democracy so inclusive and so integral to a functioning society. Because we are not willing to support this on-side proposition, I am very proud to propose today's motion. Two things I'll be illustrating in today's speech. First, what specifically side proposition's stance is in today's round, and secondly, introducing our first two substantive arguments, first on improving policy, and secondly on improving the political process as a whole. With that being said, I'd like to offer a few clarifications on side proposition's stance in today's round. First, we would define ideological purity as consistency and prioritization of one's individual beliefs. We think that an example of this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaigning for universal job guarantee, which is not consistent with her party's platform, but is something that she feels strongly with and thus uses to bolster her own political platform. Conversely, we would define party unity as adherence to party doctrine and keeping in the principles of one's own parties. We think that the proposition burden in today's round is to prove that prioritizing ideological purity is necessary to a candidate's obligation to represent their constituents in line with the principles of democracy. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our first substantive arguments on how prioritizing ideological purity improves policy. Our first layer of analysis under this point revolves around the idea of developing a stronger platform for the Democratic Party. In the majority of cases, we think that party unity is characterized by the fact that discourse and dissenting ideas are shut down in the interest of creating a homogeneous narrative on the whole for the Democratic Party. Why do we think that this is true? The first reason is that from the perspective of party leaders, divergent issues muddle the image of the Democratic Party. They have an active incentive to want to provide a cohesive narrative that they can present to the American people. But the second reason why we think this is so is because the party leaders are concerned with appealing solely to the popular opinion. They will push the principles and the narrative that they think are going to appeal to the highest number of people, and they will make that their party doctrine. Sure.
If ideological purity leads to worse outcomes in the elections, why should we still buy that principle?
Two things. First, we think that independent of practical outcomes, the purpose of a representative of a democracy and a person that is representing their constituents do have an obligation to voice their concerns in the political sphere. Independent of whether or not they are elected, they are still getting those ideas out there and they are helping their constituents be represented. But second of all, my second substantive argument will explain to you why that actually improves their chances of success in the democratic elections. But the third reason why we think that they've decided to push party unity as the major narrative is because they want to maintain control. When party leaders push their own doctrine, it means that they have complete jurisdiction over the ideas and ideology of the Democratic Party, and they're able to control it. However, we think that this has four very severe implications for the success of the Democratic Party. The first of which is that it prevents Democrats from adapting to changing norms. We live in a time that is characterized by a very quickly evolving political process. People have new ideas, new opinions, and new needs. However, the problem is that under a system of party unity, the Democratic Party's platform is never able to evolve to meet those needs as they continue to represent the needs of constituents. Thus, public support is reduced because the people feel unrepresented by the figures that they see in the Democratic Party. However, when you prioritize ideological purity, people are able to identify with the candidates they see and have confidence that they will be represented. But then secondly, under a system of party unity, you reduce the competition of ideas. Here's why we think that's very important. Because when only one set of ideals are endorsed, it basically sheds negatively on the representation of the Democratic Party, because people feel that they are not able to find candidates that represent them well, and they think that if they want to join the Democratic Party, there won't be a space for their own ideology, and are thus turned off from supporting the Democratic Party. With that being said, the last disadvantage to party unity is that it reduces media coverage. We think that when opinions don't change and the Democratic Party presents this very united facade that doesn't account for diverging opinions, it means that the media has less new opinions to capitalize and thus less of an incentive to give weight to the needs of the Democratic Party. However, conversely, when candidates prioritize ideological purity, we think that people like Beto O'Rourke, who have a new perspective, are given much more weight in the political process, more visibility, and thus more voters are exposed to the ideas of the Democratic Party and are able to find a candidate they identify with. Our second layer of analysis under this point regards the idea of legislative victories. Generally, we think that ideological purity is better conditioned for bipartisanship. On the whole, policies are created when at the midpoints of the ideologies of the two parties. That is, when both parties concede when both parties concede on an equal amount of issues to reach a compromise, that is the crux where policies are created. However, in the past decade, the trend towards Republicans becoming far more polarized has meant that the frame of reference is shifted and there's an increase in conservative policies. However, an example of this would be the Tea Party is a strong example because they support a full repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and if they were to push this bill in Congress, it would probably get it passed and it would be shifted to the right. However, the reason why we think that ideological purity solves for this issue is because it allows certain candidates to take a more moderate stance and solve for things like gridlock. Because when candidates are able to represent more moderate people, they are also able to compromise with their Republican counterparts and push policies that represent their own needs. Our second substantive argument in today's debate is the idea of increasing representation. Our first layer of analysis regards the idea of promoting geographical and cultural representation. It is obvious that different parts of the country require different forms of representations. there's no one-size-fits-all solution for one party to represent its people. However, under a system of party unity, politicians must tailor the policies to the community as a whole without accounting for individual needs and the needs of local communities. We think that ignoring ideological purity harms this representation in two ways. First, because politicians campaign solely on the party's beliefs. That means that they cannot individualize or customize because it makes the party more divisive. We give you the example of the fact that most Congress elections are actually local. So in order to increase democratic success and have these candidates be more successful, they need to be able to tailor their own policies to the needs of the people in their local communities. However, under a system of party unity, they are not able to do so because if there are any minor divergencies from their party's doctrine, they're not able to push that type of policy. But the second disadvantage is that it silences the passions of new Congress people. We think that one of the great things about the American political system is that new people that want to participate in the political system are able to do so on the basis of them being passionate about very particular issues. However, we don't think that people join politics to represent the homogenous narrative of one party. They join politics because they want to represent the needs of themselves and their constituents. However, under a system of party unity, they are not able to do so, and they're actually less incentivized to enter the political process in the first place because they don't think there's going to be a space for them and their unique ideas. In the long term, we think that means that the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party becomes exceptionally stale because people think that there's not going to be a space for evolving and changing ideologies. Our second layer of analysis under this point revolves around the idea of ostracizing particular candidates. We think that party unity fractures the Democratic Party because candidates that don't fit the expected positions will be ostracized. For example, Tom Perez's refusal to endorse the Democratic health mellow from Omaha because he was a pro-lifer caused his mayoral defeat because people in the surrounding areas did not see him as a legitimate candidate because he did not fit in the line with party unity. However, he did have a legitimate platform, he was representing people, but he was not able to be successful because people didn't see it as a legitimate platform for him to run. We think that this is harmful in a couple of ways. First, it means that there's a general inability to pass policy because when there's a sole focus on party unity, you're not able to create policy that appeals to the majority of people throughout the party. And then there's internal division because when people have different needs underneath the bracket of the Democratic Party, they're not able to push for policies that help them. At the end of the day, we believe that the purpose of politics and the purpose of candidates is to represent the needs of the people. However, under a system of party unity, they're not able to do this. I'm very proud to propose.
The first proposition speaker for her speech. To open the case for opposition side, may I now recognize the opposition first speaker.
Living in the United States, we've seen what ideological purity can do to an election. When Bernie Sanders refused to pull his supporters behind Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential elections, we got a president that does not respect basic human rights. Side proposition has not done enough in this debate to tell us why their principle actually makes it more so and outweighs the practical benefits of having more Democrats inside of the government, more Democrats making decisions, so we don't have a ban on immigration, we don't have a horrible tax bill, and we don't see a degradation in democracies. So proud to oppose today's motion. This House believes that Democratic candidates should prioritize ideological purity over party unity in the November 2018 midterms. Three things. First, I want to go over the stance of what side opposition stands for. Secondly, refutation to the major claims we hear. And secondly, an introduction to our first two substantive arguments. The first on how this establishes unity and wins elections. Secondly, we need to eliminate gridlock even after the election happens. But first of all, what is the stance of side opposition? Note that side opposition does not believe that ideological purity is insignificant or a negative thing. Nor in prioritizing party unity are we advocating to eliminate ideological purity as entirely. However, we believe for the purposes of these midterms, we need to compromise between the candidates, we need to compromise in the election, compromise within the groups to actually get the policies or get the people elected. What is the stance and what does the actual world look like on site opposition? Firstly, being that Democratic candidates should ensure there are little disputes as possible within their party. But second, we think that they ignore a huge part of the debate where we can still support people that have unique ideological decisions because it operates on a local level like they point out. What do I mean by this? When there is an election between a Democrat and a Republican, supporters of the Democrat that lost in the primary election between the two Democrats in the first place need to pool their support behind the official Democratic candidate in the race that's happening for that congressional district or for that city. That means we can still have unique needs represented in that community, but it's important to say that we need the compromising of Democratic candidates who lost and their supporters to support and go back like behind the person who is currently running against, say, the Republican candidate. We want to clarify that prioritizing party unity means we do not reject candidates who are more socialist or centrist, and means that we have to force them in these instances, or a lot of these instances, to try to comply more so. But on the local level, we think that we can also still support the needs of that community. With that, let's look towards the substantive material we get from side proposition. The first thing is, we agree with their definition on what ideological purity means. We think that party doctrine is not exactly characterized as party unity in today's debate. What do I mean by that? I think party unity can still be finding compromise and including multiple different ideas. We don't think necessarily that Democratic candidates need to stick to the most liberal or most progressive or most classical structure of defense in terms of what they believe in these elections. Let's address their first argument. They talk about how people must voice their populist concerns. We think, just as our case will go on to explain, how Democratic candidates can still do that. Firstly, in office. What do we mean by that? We think we need to focus a lot on the practical benefits and what legislation can actually be passed when these people are elected. However, we think that in office, these people can be more free to voice out their opinions. Secondly, they talk about how Democratic Party's platforms can't evolve to meet the needs. We think, once again, a lot of this can still operate on a local level in which the losing candidate in the primary of the Democratic Party can still go on and back and hold their support and still meet the needs of the community, but go.
We think it's fundamentally different when someone refuses to concede an election versus when the entire party believes in the same platform in order to get unity. That is the definition you must uphold, not this idea that you have to concede after you lose.
So I think the real heart of the motion here, right, is debating whether or not, candidates, there are multiple different sects, as they point out, in the Democratic Party, right? So should those sects stick to their ideologies till the very end of the road, or should those sects necessarily compromise when they lose elections to back up the Democratic candidate so there's more chance of the Democratic candidate being in office? That's the heart of the motion of what we're debating today. Lastly, they talk about this idea of legislative victories and that can happen with party compromise. We think the Republicans are already polarizing the status quo. What do I mean by that? I think it's very unlikely that we're going to get much compromise, especially when we're talking about the pre-election, or we're talking about just getting votes, right, to get into party, that Republicans are going to be willing to compromise. I think that in the status quo, we need to match their match their unity, and I'll explain more of that in my first substantive. With that, let's go on to substantive material. Firstly, I want to talk about how unity wins elections. First, we need to establish that side opposition makes Democratic candidates more likely to win on our side of the House, right? Let's do an analysis of how Republicans secure the executive office and legislature with a majority of seats. Republicans appeal to voters by making their individual platforms monogamous. Essentially, they made it so that voters do not have to know the candidate, just the party platform to understand how they would act in office, therefore more incentivized to vote for them. Firstly, we think, asking the question, why does this encourage people to necessarily vote? The first reason, we think it's because of approach and vote. Politics is an unsimplified form. That unsimplified form is highly confusing. Learning the crux of political issues, meaning thereby having the ability to read executive legislature, is a luxury, right? Having a simplistic, uniform set of ideas makes it more likely that the candidates are going to be elected in the first place. Instead of explaining the intricacies of Iranian history, CIA involvement in geopolitical pressure, Republicans justified leaving the Iran deal to the masses of a simple ad hominem. We need to match that in the midterm elections. Second, accessibility. Republicans condense their platforms into broad, uniform generalizations that are accessible to the masses. What does that look like? Instead of having some candidates support high-capacity magazines, some candidates support private gun shows, and some candidates not wanting wanting reform but having handguns, all Republicans simply stand for Second Amendment rights. We would tell you that more of these opinions can be specialized after these people get into office, but it's important that the Democratic candidates or the Democratic Party necessarily have unity in what they support going into that election. Here's a problem that we identify with Democratic candidates in the status quo. Democratic candidates in the status quo lack uniformity, they have individual and unique platforms. The problem is that when it takes a certain degree of privilege to explore the individualized platforms, and you have to feel emboldened to that side of the party. That's why people view the Democratic Party as one that is very elitist. It's hard to understand a lot of their policies, especially when they're arguing for a lot of different things at once. Why do we encourage this with unity? Why do we encourage better election results? We think encouraging unity unlocks an aforementioned approach to emboldening voters, approachability, and accessibility. Why? Because the U.S. will have a winner-take-all political structure as opposed to proportional representation as seen in the UK. I think that means you get a majority in the House or a majority in the Senate. We're able to turn more seats that way. Second substantive I want to talk about is the need to eliminate gridlock after the election. The layer of analysis that I want to go in to preface the argument is that the lack of unification discourages voters necessarily. The party cannot pass anything in Congress if they are not unified in their ideas. This is the biggest problem that the Democratic Party needs to necessarily address. Because if the Democratic populace does not believe that their candidates can pass bills or impact any major change, they will simply not vote for them. Here's a clarification that I want to make. Just because you have uniform ideas or compromises before the election does not necessarily mean that everyone must have the same exact idea and there is one prime and supreme idea. We think there are room for people to influence certain decisions, but we think that Democratic candidates in the end need to be unified in that decision. Right now, there's a major divide in the Democratic Party where they have their own progressive viewpoints where many members of Congress choose their either a very far left stance or a very moderate stance or either lean more towards the middle, right? That doesn't work in terms of legislation. We've seen that right now, especially because, first of all, the Republican Party has a majority, but second of all, we've seen that because Democratic candidates are less likely to have an ability to mobilize movements or mobilize their policies when they are divided within Congress. At the end of today's speech, I've proven to you that, first of all, you get better chances that you're going to actually get elected into the Congress or elected into the government. But secondly, I tell you that the post-election outcomes are also more beneficial inside opposition. We are proud to oppose.
Thank the first opposition speaker to continue the proposition case, and I'll recognize the second proposition speaker.
It seems that side opposition thinks that this debate is about ceding the ideological purity after you lose a primary election. Whenever we asked for clarification, they said, no, we just think that different sects of the Democratic Party should take a back seat so that way they look more like their Republican counterparts. We think that side opposition fundamentally misunderstands what the Democratic Party looks like in the status quo, and we think they have a lack of understanding of how this policy will actually work. That is why we are proud to propose. But first, a couple of notes on framing. Whenever they tell you that at the top of their case, they characterize the 2016 election as Bernie garnering a bunch of support, and that's the reason that Trump got elected, because he didn't rally his supporters around Hillary. The problem with this is the fact that Bernie, after he lost the Democratic primary, told his constituents to vote for Hillary. The reason why Hillary lost the election was not simply because that she didn't have enough votes. She won the popular vote. It was because the Electoral College made that not in place. We think that this misunderstanding characterized their entire case insofar as they have a lack of understanding of their examples. But moreover, whenever they tell you in their stance that they're able to compromise, we think that prioritization excludes this narrative. Why? We think it undermines their own position, the fact that they want to still have ideological purity within the Democratic Party. We think that they cross the House a little bit too much insofar as they say, yes, we think there is validity in different ideas, and we think that there is validity in different things, but we are not actually willing to punish these things. We think that that crosses the House. Second of all, whenever they talk about how party unity, they talk about how, we would tell you that party unity, whenever they discuss the doctrine, necessitates the ability to have the same stance on the different issues. For the very reasons they tell you, if they want to have access to their arguments, they have to prove that the party unity means that you all adhere to the same doctrine. In order for the party to be a coalescing force, that means that other people can have the same appreciation for candidates. You have to be under the same doctrine. We think that they have contradictions in their case, and they do not actually understand what this motion is about. In this speech, I'm going to first address their opposition's material.
First, the first substantive is on the idea of access. We would tell you that the first idea here is that candidates are able to signal voters whenever they adhere to the Democratic Party. The problem with this argument is that it doesn't justify why we actually ought to prioritize party unity over that of ideological purity. We still tell you that representation is so much more important. Insofar as they support that, we think that they concede a lot of opposition ground and they are behind in today's debate. But second, and more importantly, whenever they talk to you about how accessibility, they give you this really problematic example. They tell you that Republicans of different variations have the same idea of unity on the idea of the Second Amendment. We think that this is factually false. Why is this the case? They have different forms. If you look to moderate Republicans like Murkowski or Collins, who are in the Senate right now, versus that of Tea Party Republicans, who have very extreme ideologies, this means that although they have a coalescing force of the principle, we do not actually have these same ideas when they value ideological purity. We would actually tell you that this is an argument for the proposition, because it is what these variations in ideological purity that makes the Republican Party so successful, because they're able to appeal to such a wide voter base. But moreover, their third layer under this argument talks to you about how turning more seats. We would tell you that the prerequisite to this argument is to get elected. In order to pass policy, you have to get elected first. You don't do that if people in your community can't identify with you because you only advocate for the party doctrine. Their second substantive, which they graciously get to at 6 minutes and 45 seconds, is basically just saying that we are unable to pass policies if we prioritize ideological purity. Here's the problem with this argument. It assumes that gridlock is only because of the Democratic Party. We would tell you, with Liana's analysis that she gives you in her first speech, that the reason why we have gridlock in Congress is not because Democrats disagree with Democrats. We think that in the status quo, we have varying degrees of ideological purity, but Democrats can still come together. We think that the difference is, in their side of the House, the difference is that on principle, Republicans are what disagree with Democrats. That is what makes the harm. However, Democrats disagree with Democrats in degrees. That's the analysis that they don't really respond to. Moving on to our case. They only really give you two responses to all of the substantive materials we tell you. First, on our first substantive, they tell you basically, well, you can pass divergent opinions in office. It's important that you prioritize party unity in the first place. We would tell you, no, they can't do that, because if politicians get elected on the basis that they're going to campaign over democratic means of the doctrine of the party, then they have to actually fulfill that whenever they get elected if they want to ever get reelected. They have to fulfill their campaign promises. They can't do that if they don't get elected. But second, we would tell you that this is, again, a prerequisite. Then they have to get elected. We don't think that they're going to get elected insofar as they cannot appeal to their communities. We get no engagement with how many of these local elections are predicated upon the ability for us to see the differences in opinion and coalesce people. I'll talk more about that in my third substantive argument. But whenever we gave you 3 different reasons as to why this is going to be bad for the Democratic Party, they don't respond to it. We tell you how we prevent adaptation to challenging beliefs, about how we decrease the competition of ideas because only people who conform to the party can support it. But also, we told you about how you decrease media coverage because no one cares about it. All of these things disincentivize voters from actually getting out to vote, and so you don't actually reach out to more people on their side of the House. On our second substantive argument, basically, all they tell you is that on legislative victories, that they're going to be willing to compromise whenever they get in office. We would tell you we reject this fundamentally on the side of the proposition because people should not have to compromise on the beliefs they campaigned on to get into office. We told you about how politicians, whenever they campaign solely on the party's beliefs, cannot individualize or customize because it makes the party more divisive. Whenever we go into our third substantive argument, I'll explain to you why this is especially important in local elections. Before I move on, I'll take a point of information.
They tell you that compromise in these areas is not a good thing. We think the only way that you can actually get a positive political system is when candidates are willing to compromise. That does not happen with ideological purity.
2 problems with this. First of all, you just gave me no analysis as to why this is the case, and insofar as I provided you extensive analysis as to why this is not the case, we don't think this is true. Second of all, we think that you get more party ability to take over Congress and things of that nature whenever you have ideological purity for the very justification I just gave you. You're able to appeal to a wider voter base. If you're wanting to claim the Republican Party from your side of the House, look to what makes them successful, diversity of opinion. Moving on to the third substantive argument, which is on winning elections. We think that Democrats are more likely to win control of state legislatures, governorships, and congressional seats when they emphasize ideological purity. We think this includes more progressive and more moderate candidates. This is important because the purpose of the motion is to ask which priority can best help gain Democrats power through midterm elections. The first layer under this argument is on progressive candidates. In swing districts, candidates that abide solely by the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party are more likely to be disliked because they seem like they're just going to stop whatever Republicans put forward and then push the Democratic agenda. We think that in 2018, candidates who stand for what they believe in can win for a few reasons. First of all, People just aren't politically active. You need someone to get them engaged within the populace. In 2018, many moderates are voting for Democrats to check the Trump administration, and we think that Democratic candidates can capitalize on this and use this to proffer their own ideological purity. Americans today, second of all, are more populist than before and support candidates who take pledges against super PAC funds, distinguishing themselves from the establishment Democrats. We think these independents want to vote for people, and they have to campaign on ideological purity in order to win. Moreover, we would tell you that more moderate candidates are able to do this as well. In Republican and conservative districts, the moderation is prized. Democratic candidates in these areas often better reflect the constituents they seek to represent. Because they can meet people halfway, we think that this is empirically true. Whenever they talk to you about how we are unable to get compromise, we think we are better able to get compromise whenever there are moderate candidates who can actually negotiate with Republicans. For example, we would tell you that many moderate senators, for example, John Tester of Montana, Claire McCaskill of Missouri, they prioritize party unity. If they were to do that, they would automatically be rooted out because of the right to be relegated to the sidelines as radicals and extremes candidates. This reduces the possibility of winning because people do not actually have access to the ability to elections because people in their districts don't want to vote to them. At the end of the day, side propositions offers you a world where people are able to express their beliefs and where people are able to better get elected. For these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank the second proposition speaker. To continue the opposition case, I'd like to welcome the second opposition speaker, please.
Throughout this debate, proposition has claimed that ideological purity is what champions all in electoral processes, ignoring the fact that even when we had ideological purity in our own Democratic Party in the last election, it was not effective in actually getting us these seats in order to win. Their ideology goes against the basic scales of reality in the first place. For that reason, we oppose. A few things will happen in the speech. First, I want to go over a massive clarification because it seems like Proposition is confused on a bit of things. Second, I'm going over some attacks that we heard from everything we heard from Proposition, including difference in articles, before finally presenting the third substantive. So first, a clarification. We think they broadly misinterpret what party unity truly looks like. Party unity looks like more compromise in this first place. Why is that? Well, let's actually get pragmatic examples of this. When you have things like ideological purity, look at things like the 2016 election, where Bernie Sanders had ideological purity. He went hardcore on his own ideas, but was not willing to compromise with other ideas. He was unwavering in these very situations. The reason that as to why we saw a lot of failure in this election is because when he was not able to successfully move, even when he tried to endorse Hillary Clinton, because of his hard-line stance, his candidates, his constituents still supported this stance in the first place. Those are the consequences of having ideological purity. Oftentimes, these candidates do not actually have any level of compromise. That's why they ask us to warrant it. We just did. But moreover, let's go over some responses on their case. Firstly, they stand up here and they talk about how you develop a stronger platform in their world. We have several responses as to why this just doesn't make sense. First, we think the nexus issue in this debate, even if you take all the argument, is winning the 2018 election. So even if you think developing a stronger platform on a long-term level is actually going to be better than their world, we think on a short-term level, we will actually have better success with like this idea of party unity. But then second of all, we say a stronger platform happens in our world. Why is that? Because once again, we get that compromise. The reason as to why we saw a lot of failure within our platform in the first place is because people had drastically different ideas and were unwilling to actually talk to each other about what those ideas truly should look like. Party unity looks like compromising on these ideals. Party unity looks like saying, of course, I support free college, but that is not the angle that we need to actually take down tyranny that we see with things like Donald Trump. So I'm going to compromise and take away this perspective because that's for the commonwealth. That is what party unity truly looks like. That is what proposition fundamentally ignores. But moreover, second of all, they talked about how you're going to change norms and competing ideas and diverging opinions. why do you get diverging opinions better on our side? The problem was, in their world, when you had ideological purity, oftentimes these candidates would have diverging opinions, but they wouldn't actually have conversation about them. The problem was, they would have their own ideas, but they would be unwavering on these ideas. We didn't actually get competing ideals, we didn't get any discussion on these, rather we just had concrete opinions in the first place. That's something that they never actually engaged with. But moreover, let's talk about this idea that they say that we're suddenly going to get rid of these ideals of democracy. Firstly, we don't think that's true. Representative democracy doesn't collapse with the ideas of party unity in the first place. Just because we say that we actually want to have a unified platform towards a common goal does not mean that the scales of democracy and the Statue of Liberty falls down from New York City. We think that's a very massive exaggeration they tried to bring us in the first place. But second of all, they talk to you about this principle of how we need to support this idea of representative democracy, and here's the thing. Even if you believe that's true, recognize that democracy is actually better in our world. Our world is a world in which we can actually win elections because we're willing to compromise and be more moderate on issues. That means we actually get rid of tyranny that we see with things like Donald Trump, who is literally ruining democracy. That is our world. We get better democracies in the long run. Before I go on, go.
Why does the willingness to compromise matter if people in local elections who care about issues specific to their communities cannot ensure that the people they're electing are going to actually make change for them?
Okay. Here's the thing, when you even look at local communities, you still see the fact of the matter that Congress can still appeal to broad ideas. Just because you have party unity does not mean that you only have a few set of ideals that you have to fit under, and anything abstract from that dismisses you from the party in the first place. Once again, we don't think that's the correct characterization. Party unity just implies you're generally unified on the general ideals of your party and what you want to represent to people. That looks like representation for all. That looks like actually trying to make sure people have proper jobs. That's the ideals that you want to funnel underneath party unity. That's why we have these ideals. You can still represent your populace when you have a broad set of ideals and broad set of values that you want to represent. We don't understand as to why you can't do that in the first place. But moreover, responding to their substantive. Here's the thing. They talked about this idea about how moderates happen better in their role. We are really confused as to why this is true. We don't think moderates are only going to occur in a role of proposition. They actually occur better in our side. When once again we have these compromising ideals. The reason as to why we have a lot of extremists and populists, such as Bernie Sanders, is because we lack a will to compromise. Our world is a world in which these candidates are willing to compromise and become more moderate on these stances. That means we can actually appeal to more moderates in the long run and get more conversation on these issues and get more winning of elections as they tell you in their own case. But moreover, on our final argument, which is the third substantive about exclusion within the Democratic Party. Our first layer of analysis is elite resentment. President Trump's election is a key example of what happens when voters tire of the elite and established Democratic Party and long for dynamic change. During the 2016 elections, Hillary Clinton was viewed as politically correct, pro-establishment, and member of the political elite. Thus, rural voters who felt ignored by the urban-centric platform of the Democratic Party turned away from the party as a whole. In general, Republican voters in rural areas has been steadily increasing since 2008, up to 62% in the 2016 election. In rural areas, Trump led Clinton by 20 points. Additionally, the increasing unpopular view of the Democratic Party as a predominantly elite institution can largely explain low turnout by Democrats in the 2016 election. Why is that unique to ideological purity in the first place? We think frequently these ideologies that already exist within this platform are the ones that are gaining the most traction. We get more compromise, meaning people who are actually representing rural communities can still have debates and clashes, and the Democratic Party can adopt these ideals. But our second layer of analysis is that ideological purity leads to exclusion. American voters are tired of the establishment. People are tired with the elite and established Democratic Party. These are candidates who seem out of touch with the public. A recent poll indicated that favorable views of the Democratic Party had dropped to their lowest mark in more than a quarter century of polling. But no further than 2016 elections. Hillary Clinton was viewed as a member of the political elite. This is the reason why a lot of rural voters turned away from the Democratic Party. They felt ignored by the party as a whole. Additionally, low turnout by the Democrats in 2016 election can be largely attributed to the view of the Democratic Party being controlled by the elite. When ideological purity is prioritized, conformity to traditional views is always the primary concern. Yet no, that promoting ideological purity is promoting echo chamber at the same time. When you only voice the exact same idea repeatedly because candidates are unwilling to move, that creates more of an echo chamber on those matters. You get no change. When you have a party unity, you can still have multiple perspectives, but you have more discourse and more willing to compromise on those issues. That's why we solve this problem. But now, let's actually show what each world looks like, because I don't think the proposition has properly done that. In our world, if we hadn't had issues of ideological purity, as I already talked about in the 2016 election, we would not have a tyranny in front, a tyrant in front of our office and guiding the country of the United States, because we would actually be able to have proper compromise, and individuals wouldn't have been fully, nearly as polarized as we saw in other circumstances. Their world is a world in which individuals do not have proper health care. Their world is a world in which individuals do not have proper immigration policies and are banned from countries. Their world is a world in which sexual predators are able to get in office. Our world is a world in which congressional candidates are actually properly able to win elections because of the idea of having less conformity in the first place. When they win these elections, we get better health care for individuals. When we win these elections, we don't actually have a divided state of America. We don't actually have America hating again. We can actually properly make America greater again on our side when we actually create a unified United States. That is why we oppose.
Opposition speaker. I'd like to welcome now the third proposition speaker to continue the proposition making.
Joe Manchin was the only senator in the entire U.S. Senate who was a Democrat that voted for the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. That is one of the reasons why he is someone who is leading by 5 points in the most recent poll in a state that went for Trump by over 30 points. When we want Democrats to take over Congress, we necessarily have to have representation of individual people. And at the point where side opposition's biggest point is that they blame Bernie Sanders instead of Donald Trump for the failure in 2016, you know that they have lost this debate. In my speech, two things. First, two clarifications on this round, before second, moving into our three questions. First, which side best promotes representation? Second, which side best gets seats in the 2018 midterms? And third, which side best passes good policies in the long term? First, on clarifications, two things. Number one, party unity is the unifying belief in a cohesive platform, which means that side opposition must defend running on the same platform regardless of geographical diversity. This is incredibly important because we're saying that ideological purity allows for adaptation. Bernie Sanders can run as an incredibly progressive individual in Vermont, but you're going to need someone different like Doug Jones in Alabama if you want to win in red states. Secondly, we don't think that compromise is the same thing as blank adherence to platform. Side opposition has to defend party unity, which means that all individuals believe and advocate for the same policies. We believe that you can have your own set of coherent beliefs, but still compromise on what you actually pass in Congress. Those are not mutually exclusive things. First question, which side best promotes representation? Side opposition doesn't give you a lot of content here, but side proposition spends 4 minutes of constructive material telling you a robust defense for ideological purity's capacity to represent people. Number one, by increasing representation for diverging opinions amongst the general public. Number two, increasing media coverage for new opinions amongst the Democratic Party. And number three, using disagreement to synthesize and create a new consensus and new platform in the long term. The only response from opposition is that they tell you this is not very important. The practical is far more relevant in this debate to win elections. First of all, we think that the principle is crucial because it is the reason why candidates who are in office are there in the first place. They must represent their voters at the point where candidates are more beholden to their party than the people who elected them. Our country is more an aristocracy than a democracy. Secondly, we think this is an individual and independent reason for why you vote for side proposition. The fact that they refuse to engage means that they basically concede this argument to us. It is far too late for them to begin refuting it in the op block. Third, even at their highest ground, we will win on the practical in our next two questions. Second question, which side gains the most seats? Opposition tells you that party unity is necessary to create a cohesive platform for Democrats. We're going to tell you why that is untrue for 4 reasons. Number one, we think that party unity is bad because it is hard to adapt in districts that do not believe in solidly democratic ideals. The Democratic platform is created by people across the country, but most Democrats are in bluer states like California, New York, and New Jersey. When they craft platforms, it won't necessarily be effective in every individual district. So Heidi Heitkamp, who is running in North Dakota, is not going to be running on the same liberal beliefs as Bernie Sanders in Vermont. Secondly, we think that cohesive, overarching principles with different platforms still allow people to vote for Democrats even with different beliefs. The Democratic Party fundamentally believes in a same set of principles despite different degrees of policies. They believe in egalitarianism, they believe in civil rights, and those are things that will be extended despite, no matter which candidate is running in an election. Number 3, it is ahistoric. Democratic candidates right now are succeeding because of their divergence from political orthodoxy. Conor Lamb in Pennsylvania was able to turn a seat that Donald Trump won by 24 points with a 0.4% victory, and Doug Jones was able to win in Alabama, the first senator to represent a red state in 4 decades. That means that adaptation in these regions have been proven to be successful, and they will continue to be doing so in the 2018 elections. Finally, at their highest ground, the cohesive platform does not galvanize voters to turn out. So even if you believe that it is good to have a cohesive platform, people are not excited by it in individual elections and in individual states. In order to adapt, you must look at the needs of those individuals. Go.
When we had ideological purity in the 2016 election, the reason as to why we saw a decrease in turnout was because the polarization that ideological purity created in the first place.
Absolutely disagree. The reason there is a lack of turnout can be attributable to a lot of things. For example, voter suppression in places like Georgia and Florida. For example, things like the Republican Party running on a populist platform versus an establishment Democrat. We don't believe in that party unity, and we think that the assumption that all Democrats had to support Hillary Clinton in and of itself is corrosive and disturbing, because we think that oftentimes she represented the exact elitism that they said was so problematic on our side of the House. We think that if you really want divergence of ideas, you need to shift your policy platforms and adapt to what the American people need. At that time, it was populism. Proposition tells you that we can adapt to swing districts by being far more moderate to appeal to independents, and adapt to Republican districts by making certain ideological and policy-based concessions. But they only tell you that ideological purity will only entrench elitism, which they just give you 2 minutes on as a last speech. So we're going to refute this in 2 ways. First of all, this is fundamentally untrue. We think that people who reject the establishment and party unity usually use ideological purity to distance themselves from the establishment. For example, Tom Malinowski, running in New Jersey's 7th District, is not taking any money from super PACs and large campaigns. Antonio Delgado in New York's 19th District is doing the same pledge. Democratic candidates around the United States are saying that we want to distance ourselves from the establishment, but it necessitates ideological purity for that to be part of your platform. Secondly, ideological purity increases a difference of opinions and disrupts these echo chambers that they tell you are so dangerous. The fact that they want the entire party to believe in the same partisan positions means that they don't believe in representation and adaptation around the country, but more importantly, that they want to entrench the echo chambers because there is only one set of ideas that is supported by that party. Before I move on to my third point, go.
Why do you need ideological purity for people to not accept funds from the Democratic Party with things like grassroots movements?
Because the reason why there is a problem in the status quo is because of this party unity concept. The idea that everyone has to adhere to the same structure of elections, the same policy platforms, and the same ideas that the Democratic Party fundamentally believes in. The rejection of the establishment is what we're saying is fundamental to ideological purity. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York is not taking campaign donations from super PACs. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Beto O'Rourke in Texas, all of which are candidates that are succeeding immensely compared to previous Democratic candidates that stood to party and partisan adherence. Third question, which side best passes good policy? Opposition says that you can eliminate gridlock in the long term. But first, it's untrue because Republicans will still filibuster and vote against this, which means that you have no net benefit on their side. But second, you have to fulfill your campaign promises in order to get reelected if you are a Democrat. If you believe in something, you ought to defend it in Congress to actually stand by representation. That is how democracy works in the first place. When you violate that, those Democrats lose elections in the future, and these party platforms are never enacted. Proposition says that you can craft better policy in 2 ways. First, by using the diversity of thought to adapt to the needs of your constituents. But secondly, having policies that are more liberal by requiring more conservative concessions by having a larger array of ideologies. The only response that we hear is that we only should value the short term in 2018. But that is fundamentally untrue, because this is about the candidates themselves and also their long-term political careers. If you ever want to buy any arguments on good policy that they give you, you have to buy that the long term is incredibly important in this debate. Fundamentally, side proposition believes that individuals should hold on to what their own beliefs are. They should be able to adapt to their own districts and states, regardless of what the party believes in. We don't believe in blind adherence to ideology, but side opposition does. And under that world, you refuse to engage with the diversity of opinion, with the diversity of thought, and the problems within our democracy that have only grown because of this idea that party unity is the the most important idea within the party. The Democratic Party, if they want to win in the next election, must adapt and change, and that can only happen with ideological purity. Thank you.
I thank the third proposition speaker. I'd like to welcome now the final substantive speaker, the third opposition speaker, please.
If we want to change the current climate of politics right now and get rid of the gridlock and the polarization we are being seen since the 2016 election, we need to prioritize party unity. In this speech, I will be doing a couple things. One, I will be going over some clarifications of today's debate, and then I will be clarifying today's debate into 3 clear questions. 1, what side is best for the 2018 midterm election? 2, what side is best for the post-election? And finally, what side is best at representing? So first on clarifications. We got a little confused about what compromise is on the debate. So let me clarify it. Darian tells you in his second speech that it looks like recognizing like free college. When Bernie Sanders goes to the Senate, when Bernie Sanders goes to the Congress and puts this bill up forward, we're going to see that he's not going to get any votes because of the gridlock already. We need more Democratic candidates in the Congress, and that is not going to be shown if we prioritize ideological purity over over this. No, thank you. Over party unity. We need to see that we need party unity to get more Senate seats in the Congress. How do we address the issue of the college of Bernie's bill? Well, I would like to argue that in districts that people are not likely to vote for people in really radical candidates because it's already polarizing in the first place. So what this means essentially is they bring up examples about red states and how these people are not going, how it is different from California to Alabama. But what we're essentially saying is that 1, okay, that's already polarizing in the first place. The Democrats have a very little chance of winning. And 2, what we're essentially seeing is that when you have a party unity, you have a backing. You have that unity of that party. So now going on to the first question. What side is best during the midterm elections for 2018? We see that the 2018 midterm elections are going to be extremely important this year. Why? Because Democrats need to get 23 seats back to have the majority. This is important because for the last 2 years after Donald Trump got presidency, we saw that we had more polarization, we had more gridlock within Congress. We saw that it's turned into Trump's America because of this ideological purity. We saw the 2016 midterm. They on a proposition say that Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton is not an example. However, it is an example because when you look towards it, when Bernie Sanders after Bernie Sanders lost the primaries, the people that wanted Bernie to win obviously did not vote for Hillary because they had such strong opinions. Because Bernie Sanders didn't completely back up Hillary Clinton, it gave them this inherent bias. No, thank you. So next, we also see that it increases Democratic representation in Congress, and this is extremely important because we need more seats. So why should we prioritize party unity? Why should we prioritize party unity over ideological purity? Is because this is the only way we can see Democrats getting seats back. By the time we give the party backing to all these Democrats, we're going to see that these Democrats are going to get more seats. But before I go on, I can take a POI.
If Democrats want to swing typically red states, why shouldn't they adapt to the needs of those particular voters?
Okay, so what we're essentially saying is that they can still adapt to the needs, right? We're just prioritizing party unity. That can still happen in our world. We're not saying that they can completely not adapt, right? We're going to see that there's still going to be a little progressive candidates on here. They're just going to be backing with the party. They're all going to be in support. Right? So next we also see it establishes more unity and we will win the election. So in our first substantive, we talk about how party unity is good and we give you 2 reasons. 1 for the approachability and 2 for the accessibility. Right? Because we see that for the approachability that the Democrats have had in a long time, that politics have been in a very unsimplified form in the Democrat candidates. So what we see here is that when we have this party unity, when we take a generalized stance all together, we're going to see this be very beneficial because it's going to be understandable for the vast majority of people, right? And that leads me to my second point of the accessibility that we see in the Republican Party. They take a broad, unified generalization, and that helped them gain more votes in the 2016 election. So, now going on to the second question, what side is best at representation? So we see this for a few reasons, right? They bring up this point about local communities. However, we think that we serve local communities better, because just because you make a united party stance doesn't mean you can't apply it to the issues important to your local communities. We see that these candidates choose platforms because they can build upon it. We can see that they can adapt it to their district, but however, that would not mean that they would prioritize that over their party unity. We give you an example about how from Hopkins provides an answer that is both simple and convincing, right? Voters and donors and activists are more likely to judge elected officials on whether they pass an ideological purity test than on rather they bring tangible benefits to their districts. They don't want to see this trait in their candidates. There is a study that in the past few decades, Hopkins shows that Americans have grown less able to name their governor and less likely to vote in local elections. Conversely, they now much have a stronger feeling about national figures, like senators and presidential elections, and they choose whether their party got to occupy the White House or the governor's mansion. Most would pick the former. Even the attention of the donor class has been nationalized. From 1998 to 2012, the amount of money poured into the average Congress race has doubled. What we see here is that through prioritizing this ideological purity, it's not going to be beneficial, whatever. We saw that in the case. We see that we have to prioritize party unity, specifically in the status quo, because it's the only way we can get more seats in the in Congress this year. But I can take your friend.
Considering that people are far more likely to donate to candidates that they see as actually having a set of standards, besides simply adhering to party politics, why is it not more likely that they will get more money when they run up their own ideology?
Okay, so what we're essentially saying is that they're not going to completely go with their entire party and have the same points, right? We're saying that they just need to have their each other's backs, right? We want them to have a party unity, not have the same complete platform. You guys keep bringing up this point about how it's different in each state. However, that's not the case. What we're saying here is that if the parties, we just need to back them up, because in the 2016 election, as we keep bringing up, with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, what we saw there in that case scenario is that when Hillary Clinton won the primary, we saw we lost all the Bernie supporters. We saw more gridlock there.
Last chance.
No, thank you. So now going on to my last question about what side best represents representation. Going back to my final question about what side best represents representation, we represent local communities because we see, as I showed you in my last case, that many people don't want to see the tangible benefits the district has. They want to see if they have ideological purity that is persistent with these candidates. We see that we don't want this on side opposition, because on side proposition, all we're going to be seeing is a 2016 election all over again, and we on opposition do not want that to be.
Then the third opposition speaker to start the reply speeches, and I welcome the reply speaker from opposition side, please.
Side proposition has fundamentally forgotten about the stance that we've given you since the first speech on side opposition. They've misconstrued it and they've strongmanned it to a point in which we don't even know what our side looks like anymore, because they've only been misrepresenting it. But I'll tell you what it looks like. Just because you prioritize party unity doesn't mean you eliminate every case of ideological purity. That has been something that's been said on side opposition since the first speech. It doesn't mean you become robots of the party and just regurgitate information that the party tells you to. That's not what it means. We tell you that having party unity means you are able to compromise with an idea, so you have a certain amount of leeway in terms of localizing and adapting to what issues are important inside of your communities. It doesn't necessarily mean that you get rid of every single unique idea within the Democratic Party, especially because we talk extensively about post-election outcomes on our side as well. The way we're going to handle this reply is we're doing it on a two-world basis on the two most important issues. The first is the best election outcomes, who best assures that. I think that also includes representation. And the second, basically, on the post-election outcomes, who can actually best pass legislation or what that looks like. on both worlds. So the first on best election outcome, election outcomes for each side. Side propositions access to good outcomes as the ability to adapt to local communities, right? They make all of their analysis on this, like they concede to that fact. Tatum addresses this. We pointed out a couple of things. The first is, we can still have adaptation on our side. Look at Tatum's response, which tells you, you can adapt these central ideas of that Democratic Party, but you can still localize them to where you can make those issues or make those ideas important on a local level. We don't think necessarily that that doesn't happen entirely on the opposition side of the House. But secondly, even if you don't buy that, we would tell you that if they are arguing that they adapt their fundamental views in order to win a localized election, that means you violate your own principle, how people need to be pure to the end, how people need to stick to their ideology to the end. If you are saying, ultimately, these people are able to change their views based off of that local election, at the end of today's debate, we don't think they've actually stuck by their principle implementation. We don't think they get the best outcomes. Why? Because we look at the more realistic world that we give you on-site opposition. What does that mean? What do we bring to you in terms of the election outcomes that happen? Firstly, we think we give you a clear definition of what compromise necessarily means in today's debate, right? We clearly give you, that Darian tells you, that compromise doesn't only look like creating one hodgepodge of ideas that is regurgitated through every single politician or every single candidate. We think what it necessarily looks like, and what Darian told you, and what Tatum extended, is having, look, we have this view on education. This view is necessarily too radical to win an election, but we think that we can still address the views of education through a different compromise, We can still win you that election, right? We give you really, really good analysis about how Republican candidates were able to win. They brush that off by simply saying that Republican candidates aren't able to win that way, but they don't respond to the numerous layers of analysis we give you. The first on accessibility, how Republicans are able to use compromise to show that accessibility. Secondly, about the approachability of your policies. If there's too many ideas going on, no matter on a localized level, the party's not going to be ideological, the party's not going to be preferable on a national level, the party is going to gain a majority on the national level. But now in terms of comparative analysis on the terms of post-election outcomes, we would tell you that having the Democratic Party have a unified opinion is a prerequisite to having the ultimate gridlock, right, to solving gridlock. We think in order to solve gridlock, the Democratic Party needs to know what they want. If gridlock exists within the Democratic Party itself, which is what I tell you since my first speech, the Democratic Party is unable to represent their own views, the Democratic Party is unable to represent what they all want, and not able to represent the people they really care about on-site proposition. Here's what's really important when you recognize the outcomes or the effects of post-election outcomes. The Democratic Party is unable to actively represent the people they want to help if they are still divided. We would tell you that sure, there's a certain amount of compromise when the candidates actually get elected where they can still address more radical viewpoints now, but more so we would still tell you that there needs to be a unified decision. At the end of today's debate, side proposition doesn't address the layers of analysis that we tell you about why it is important to have a compromise, why that necessarily means that voters are more likely to vote for that candidate. They don't address the post-election outcomes we're so proud to oppose.
Finally, to conclude this very debate, I'd like to welcome the reply speaker from Proposition 6. Very much.
The fact that side proposition only engages with the principled material in this debate for 30 seconds in the opposition bloc shows you that they're more morally bankrupt than their candidates are financially bankrupt. We think that in this debate, it is boiled down to a couple of things, but mainly we should analyze the comparative worlds. Now, I'd love to spend my entire reply doing that, but unfortunately, I have to come up here in the prop reply and spend a couple of seconds on framing. Now, we think that party unity is obviously, as we've shown you down the bench, adherence to doctrine. Why is this the case? Whenever they tell you that party unity means that we have to be able to compromise, we think that this is false because we can always compromise. We think that's the nature of a politician. Bernie Sanders compromises even though we think he's a very ideological, pure candidate. We provided you this analysis consistently down the bench. We think at the point where they try to gain offense on a marginal difference within the op bloc, we think that's the point where it's gotten too far. They try to cross the house too much with this analysis, with this interpretation. We think you should prefer ours. But with that, let's look at their worlds for a second. We think that in their world, people are less represented. Why is this the case? Basically, the analysis that we've given you in every single speech down the bench. We've told you that the views will be less representative because you have to adhere to party doctrine, so you are actually silencing the passions of the new people who are coming into Congress. This will translate into worse policy later, but let's focus for example on what this means. This means that party doctrine will actually translate into more establishment views within the representation that comes about. Reagan brings you this analysis in his speech, and it goes unengaged with by the opposition. We necessarily think that these views will be like more elitist and more establishment, and that we think that brings less support and is less representative of the vast base that the Democratic Party supports. But moreover, we think that all of their analysis about the practical arguments are built on winning seats. We told you that you cannot have this because you have to tailor to communities in order to win seats. We told you this is especially true in swing states. And we told you this is especially true whenever you have these like establishment mentality. So people like Doug Jones, Beto O'Rourke, or Connor Bland can only win seats in their districts because they have ideological purity. When they say that Democrats will have approachability if they adhere to party unity, we think that it is better on our side of the house because they are approachable as a member of your community, not as a member of the establishment. We give you 3 reasons additionally why on their side of the house policy will get worse. First of all, we told you about how we prevent adaptation. So basically, you aren't able to get any actual change because people are unwilling to change their beliefs. Second of all, we told you decrease competition of opinion, which necessarily means that you get less diversity of thought on their side of the house. Third and finally, this is super important. We talked to you about media coverage and how the media is less incentivized to cover the actual Democratic candidates. We told you, fourth and finally, that gridlock will still exist on their side of the house. So even if they are able to coalesce the Democratic Party entirely, which we don't think will happen, we still think that there are going to be Republican responses to this. What did our side tell you? They basically had a really good time mischaracterizing this in the op block, but our stance has been clear the entire debate. We've told you that we care about representation for people, and we think ideological purity is the key to this representation. We think the purpose of a campaign was to represent your constituency, and even if we buy ops weird framings, you would still vote them down because they suppress the representation of their community insofar as they tell you that you have to compromise the second that you get to Congress. We think that this is principally inconsistent. We would tell you on our side of the house as well, more candidates get elected because they are viewed as more representative of their communities. We would also tell you that we result in better policy. Why is this the case? First of all, we told you this really detailed analysis in Prop 1 about how liberal policies will actually result from this because we're able to shift the mechanism by which we're able to do this, meaning that whenever more liberal policies are introduced, we shift the debate further. But we also told you that we have diversity of thought, which is of paramount importance. Reagan gave you this analysis whenever he told you that this is the reason that Bernie Sanders is able to normalize ideas like free college or normalize ideas like universal health care. At the end of this debate, it came down to the comparative. We gave you detailed and structural analysis as to why representation is so important in this case. We also gave you analysis as to why we get better policy and why they get fewer candidates on their side of the house. All of their impacts were hinged on the practical, but the problem with this is that in order to get these impacts, they had to get elected, and they don't do this. We are proud to propose.
I thank all the debaters. Please cross the floor, shake hands. This now concludes the grand final debate, and we'll announce the result back in the main hall in 305.